Hello, my name is Eric Moore. I'm with the English Language Testing Society. This is the Testing in 10 interview for the month of May. And our guest today is Dr. Misty Wilson of IELTS USA. Welcome, Misty.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. And so first, Misty, I know you were recently awarded your doctoral degree. And what area of research did you focus on?
So I was looking, my doctorate is in education, and my doctoral study looked at decision-making among admission professionals regarding which language tests they were going to accept for their incoming international students and what scores they were going to set.
This is a very timely topic, obviously, so it was a great selection, I think, on your part, and something a lot of people would love to talk about and find out more about.
Yeah, and I actually became interested in this topic. I joined IELTS USA 2 years ago, and before that I was in higher ed for about 15 years, teaching language learners, and then the last 6 directing an ESL program. So I noticed that the admissions department was making decisions about which tests to accept and what scores to set, and sometimes they would invite me into these conversations and sometimes not. So I was curious, how they were making sense of this decision and what that process was like. So I interviewed admission professionals who had recently accepted a new test and set the score. And I guess just to give you my elevator pitch of the findings, one of the findings was that, which kind of surprised me, was that participants in my study had really little guidance from their institution in terms of like how to make these decisions, how to choose tests, how to set scores even. And so they were making these decisions based on, kind of with the main goal of hitting enrollment targets. And so they weren't really necessarily investigating the test under consideration. They kind of ask around, but they weren't looking at like language test experts or anything like that. So I found that kind of surprising and maybe a little concerning as the market continues to increase and all these new tests are popping up left and right.
That's a good point. I spoke with an admissions individual, not at my institution, but at another one, and that person, old friend of mine had mentioned, yeah, we just ask other people in admissions what they feel or how they feel about it rather than asking a testing person like you. So I said, well, start asking us. That's better. Okay. Yeah. Why is it important for non-native English speaking students who will attend university or college in an English medium environment to have high levels of proficiency?
Yeah, there's been some previous studies on this that have tried to link English language proficiency to academic outcomes, particularly GPA. And so most of these studies have been, quantitative and there's kind of a mixed bag results really. But I think consensus is that there's a threshold of language proficiency that's needed for students to have the chance to be successful, right? So part of the difficulty in these studies that have been conducted is that there's so many other factors that come into play once a student's on campus, right? So it's not just an easy, linkage between that language score and their GPA, because there's motivation, there's familial support, there's, the academic rigor of the institution even, right? So but this consensus, I think, is that there's a threshold that's needed. And we know that as ESL professionals. We know that students need a certain level of language proficiency. And that's not going to guarantee all A's, right? That's just to be able to be able to have that chance at being successful. So, and not only is it important just to have this overall kind of proficiency, but it's really important that when we look at the 4 skills, so that students have the reading and listening and speaking and writing skills that they need. And in particular, that concerns me. I hear some programs, as we move to like test optional, some programs are like, well, I'm just going to have admissions review the interviews of students to determine whether they need ESL. And then I'm like, oh my goodness, how can you tell if a student has any reading skills at all from that interview? Right. And we know like students, depending on where they're coming from, they might have really strong speaking skills, but lack the reading skills needed. So, yeah, it's important, for them to have, that balanced skill set that they need to be successful.
What are the consequences that may arise from, universities and college enrolling unprepared students, or as you mentioned, somebody who might have really good, really strong speaking skills, but not be able to read or perhaps write academically very well?
Yeah, this was actually another finding from my study, was that the participants in my study didn't really seem to be aware of some of the consequences of enrolling unprepared students. And so some of those consequences, I guess the most obvious, academic achievement, in particular the initial term, because studies have found that, as students are progressing through a program, they're going to be building their language skills. So it's really important that in those initial terms of study, and that's really where we might see some initial struggling, but not just academic achievement. There's also issues, surrounding socio-emotional wellness. And so, if students don't have the language needed to be able to socialize and connect with not just peers, but their faculty as well, we see the students that are isolating more, and that leads to mental health issues. And another kind of sometimes overlooked consequence is on the faculty, who may not be prepared to teach linguistically and culturally diverse students. And so I think this is really important, that when institutions are enrolling large, any number of international students, that they look at them as more than just like, filled seats, but they really think about what are these students going to need from us as an institution? How can we prepare our faculty to not water down the learning outcomes, but be able to really, adapt to the needs of our students? And another consequence that recently I've been hearing a lot of is academic integrity issues. So students who, there's increases in plagiarism, and this can happen, when students who are not prepared for the language, right? And they have so much pressure from their family to do well, right? I mean, we see students, particularly from Asian countries, and the amount of stress that they carry to do well in their studies. And I've had a number of times just in the past, in my role as director, talking with students who have plagiarized in one of their classes and have been suspended, and the impact that it has on them and their family. I mean, it's just huge consequences. And so I think it's even more important that that institutions are really careful about not just the tests that they're using for their applicants, but also the score that they're setting, that they're not just choosing scores based on what other institutions have chosen, but that it's really a decision based on their own academic rigor, their own student support, because these consequences is more than just failing a class.
Very interesting, and great points. I know something that's come up within the last two institutions, or my current institution, my past institution, was discussion of inadvertent plagiarism or inadvertent cheating that happened just because of not understanding the academic culture, for example, here in the United States.
Yeah, and really important to you can't explain enough, right? And so I think some institutions sometimes feel like, oh, well, we had this little module on Blackboard that they watched and they signed a contract that we're done. But it has to be in every course. It has, every faculty has to take kind of ownership of instructing students and helping students understand it, because it's such a cultural difference for some. And especially when it's unintended, that really just breaks my heart, when there's these consequences for students who really did not understand what they were doing.
Definitely. That's sad when they don't mean to do that at all. And they're even horrified that they're being accused and they did something. Yeah. That's unfortunate. My last question for you, for ESL and EFL classroom instructors and the programs that they're part of, how can they best prepare their students for proficiency tests?
Yeah, I think there's a bit of a difference between test prep and language development, right? And so we need to be clear what can be done in a certain amount of time, and be open to our students about this. So if you have a student who's, let's say they're in IELTS 6, and you've got a 10-week IELTS prep program, you're not going to be able to get them to a 7.0 most likely, right? Because that is a huge increase in language development that needs time. And so test prep should be, you can include development, I guess, language development within that, but again, just look at the time. So they can best prepare their students by being honest with where they're at and what they can achieve in the amount of time that they have.
Students and sometimes caregivers or family members, et cetera, sometimes have some very unreal expectations about jumping from, like you said, from an IELTS 3 to a 8.5 in the matter of
Right.
a week
Or
apart
even,
study.
yeah, even sponsoring organizations, right, who only allow students to take ESL for 6 months. And so we'll come in and, you know, be like in a level 1 of a 6-level program, and then the pressure on them. So yeah, I mean, I think that there's a little bit more that we need to do to help. Just also our institutions sometimes don't realize that students need more than 1 term. And that was something else in my finding. The admission professionals felt safe in their decision to accept this new test, even though they weren't like 100% sure about it, because they had safeguards. And one of the safeguards was a 1-term ESL class. And so my thought was, you know, after I went away with it, I was like, what if they need more than 1 term? What happens, right? Some students need longer to develop based on where they're at.
Definitely. Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Wilson. Thank you so much for your time. A pleasure to speak with you. Thank you for all of your thoughts and everything here today. And thank you to our sponsor again. And see you next month, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for having me.